Very good. Well, I think we'll make a start. My name's Monica Bohm-Duchin, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all tonight to what promises to be a truly wonderful event. I speak on behalf of Lund Humphries, the publisher of the book on Ralph Beyer, and also on behalf of Insiders Outsiders. I'd like to just say a few very brief words about that, if I may, by way of starting things off. As some of you will know, this was conceived by me in the first instance, I must admit, some while ago now, but as a year-long nationwide arts festival intended to pay tribute in the most kind of comprehensive but also nuanced and perhaps more analytical way to the tremendously rich contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated or Nazi-occupied Europe to this country's culture, a topic that is very often sort of touched upon en passant, but very rarely, I think, scrutinized in enough detail. And of course, I don't really have to say it, how well Ralph Beyer fits into that broad kind of remit. It finished the festival as a kind of physical event across the country, came to a rather abrupt halt in March last year, 2020, but much to my delight, it's had an unexpectedly rich afterlife in the form of a rich program of online events, which are indeed very much ongoing. So without further ado, let me just sort of touch on one or two small practicalities. I think I've already, or most of you will already have made yourselves invisible, if you wouldn't mind, as well as inaudible, just for the purposes of the recording. So if I could just remind you to do that. As regards chat, I think you all know the ropes by now, probably ad nauseam. If you wouldn't mind, at whatever point you feel appropriate, to type your questions into the chat function. I will be vetting them and fielding them as appropriate towards the end. The event will be recorded and uploaded in a few days' time, if not before, to the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, so just bear that in mind. And yes, I would also just perhaps put yourselves, or put the setting on speaker view so that you see just the one person speaking at any given moment. Now, you probably already know we have very sort of esteemed participants tonight, but I'm going to hand over in the first instance to Edmund de Waal, who I think needs no real introduction. He is particularly relevant not only because he knew, I believe I'm right, aren't I, Edmund, Ralph well, he was a close family friend of your parents, but also you wrote a lovely introduction, a foreword to the current book. So I think, yes, please, over to you, Edmund, first of all.
Thank you so much, Monica. Well, this evening brings together so many people, places and ideas that I passionately care about, all centered on the extraordinary work and that life of Ralph Beyer. So it's a huge privilege just to open this evening and to be part of tonight, particularly as I'm also a patron of Insiders Outsiders. So it's a wonderful umbrella to be opening up this evening with. I met Ralph for the first time in the summer of 1977 in Canterbury. He was brought down to lunch in our house in Canterbury by the architect Keith Murray, who was an old friend of his. My parents had moved to Canterbury Cathedral the previous year. Both of them, Esther and Victor de Waal, had been part of the liturgical movement of the 1950s and 60s, the kind of rethinking radically of what sacred space might mean. And it was a group of theologians, architects, and craftspeople, and clerics, all of whom had come together to think about what new church buildings might mean and around the liturgy. Keith Murray was central to this, alongside his partner, Robert Maguire, two architects who had built wonderful and radical and revolutionary buildings, including a wonderful incendiary new church at Bow Common. And they had asked Ralph Beyer to do, I think, the most extraordinary early part of his lettering for that church. So Ralph was part of this group, and Keith Murray was the way that the conduit towards our family life. He came down to Canterbury. He designed for Canterbury Cathedral extraordinary lettering to be used for all the signage and the paper, and also lettering, actual lettering for parts of the cathedral too. And he became part of the fabric of our ongoing family life. It was also very, very significant because he was one of those early encouragers of craft. There I was, a young potter, and here was this person who talked with great seriousness about what craft meant, about looking back, but looking forward with intensity and integrity about the possibilities of craft. When I looked at his lettering, I was amazed by how words felt strongly poetic. He used space in a way that felt very akin to David Jones, that words had weight, and it's something that I've carried with me throughout my life. As you know, Ralph was instrumental in making the most extraordinary lettering of the 20th century, in my opinion, in Coventry Cathedral. And when you walk into Coventry Cathedral and you see Ralph's lettering, and you see the great candlesticks flanking the altar at the end, flanking Sutherland's great tapestry, you're in the presence of really the greatest craft, I think, of the 20th century in Britain, in a church interior, both created by Jewish, exiled, assimilated artists. Discuss. That has to be part of this evening's conversation. So Ralph is in our life. My mother is a friend of Jane Owen in New Harmony, so Ralph is there too. And then after, when Ralph dies, I'm chair of the Craft Study Centre, and I'm very fortunate to help acquire his archive for the Craft Study Centre, a marvellous, rich archive that has formed the basis of John Neilson's remarkable, beautiful, beautiful book on Baer, which we're celebrating tonight. So we have John, a great artist, great friend, great letterer. We have Tanya Harrod, greatest interlocutor on crafts in the world, and also a friend. And at the heart of tonight, we have the marvellous Ralph Bayer's legacy. Take it away, you two lovely people. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Edmund. Wonderful. Sadly, you can't stay with us, but I do thank you very much.
I'll be watching.
You'll be watching. Very good. Lovely. So let me now hand over in the first instance to John, who will later be in conversation with Tanya. But if I may, I'd like to introduce both of them while I have the chance. John Neilson, indeed, an important practitioner in his own right, I think terribly important for the kind of integrity and the special approach of the book, a letter carver and a lettering designer, as many of you will know. After a training in formal calligraphy, he learnt letter carving in stone from Tom Perkins, embarking on his own career in the early 1990s. Based in Wales now, he's worked, exhibited and taught throughout the UK and overseas, and has been editor since 2003 of the lettering journal Forum. He got to know Ralph Beyer in the early stages of writing this book. And I think perhaps, Tanya, I will introduce you now also, if I may, to sort of allow the transition more seamlessly later on. Tanya Harrod, an independent design historian, much praised just now, quite rightly, I'm sure, by Edmund, living in London, who writes widely on craft, art and design. Her major study, The Crafts in Britain in the 20th Century, was published in 1999. The Last Sane Man, her biography of the potter Michael Cardew, was published in 2012. For this, she was awarded the James Tate Black Prize for biography. She's co-editor at the Journal of Modern Craft, and I think very pertinently, I should add that she interviewed Ralph Beyer at great length in 2000 for the Craft Life section of National Life Stories at the British Library. I don't know how easily accessible those are, Tanya, perhaps you can tell us later, and indeed spoke at his funeral in 2008. Lovely. So I think let's hand over to you, John. And do you want me to screen? Would you like me to screen share straight away? Yes, I think.
Yes, if we could have the first.
Okay, no problem.
Slide, maybe.
Let's move on from that. Next one. Hold on. I know what that is. Yeah, that's the one that's gone to the bottom instead of the top. There we go. Right. Good, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Monica, and thanks, Edmund, for that introduction. This is interesting technology, and good evening to all of you, if you are out there. Thanks for tuning in. Well, this is the man that we're discussing tonight, Ralph Beyer. And in this picture, he's carving, or perhaps he's pretending to carve, since he seems to have finished the piece. It might just be for the photograph. A verse by Philip Larkin as part of a series of sculptures that he made in Hull around 1970, when he was in his late 40s. So Ralph Beyer was a letter carver. That is, he carved inscriptions, mostly in stone, but sometimes in other materials such as wood or metal. And he did a small amount of lettering of other kinds, such as typeface design, drawn lettering for print. And he was also a sculptor, mainly in stone. But it's his letter carving we're going to concentrate on tonight. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and necessarily I'm going to have to leave out a huge amount of his output and just focus on a few things. Next slide, please, Monica. I'm incapable of doing this myself, so Monica is kindly forwarding the slides. Right, a lot to look at here. So, like most letter carvers, then and now, Ralph Beyer's work was largely to commission and included memorials, as you can see on the top left there. He probably made about 100 or so of these memorials, which you can still see in churchyards and cemeteries up and down the country. And some of them are, in a way, his most engaging pieces. They were done for clients who really wanted and appreciated them. There were also foundation stones, as you can see in the middle at the top there, tablets for the opening of buildings and things like that. And then larger, more architectural lettering, such as the inscription at the bottom left, which is for a school chapel in Taunton, set into plaster, or the others on the right, which we'll be returning to. Next slide, please. But Ralph Beyer also carved literary texts of his own choosing. Sometimes these were commissioned, sometimes not. This one is a text from Rainer Maria Rilke, who was his favorite poet, I believe, obviously translated into English here. And this comes from quite late on in Ralph's career, around about 1987. So you could say it represents his mature style. So I thought it would be useful to see this for those of you not familiar with his work. If you wanted to sum it up, you could perhaps say restrained irregularity. That might do the job. There's a constant variation in any individual letter throughout the inscription. If you have a look here, you can see that no two E's are quite the same, no two A's are quite the same. Things don't quite line up, especially the top line of the letters. There's a varying rhythm of spacing. It looks a bit cramped in some places, wide in others, if you look at it according to classical standards. And the carving itself is quite rough. You can't really see that here. But these are all of a piece, and it would be a mistake to judge these things by classical standards. But it's easy to forget that when Beyer started out in the early 1950s as an independent letter cutter, formal Roman capitals were still very much the thing. Eric Gill had pioneered a revival in letter carving, following on from the calligraphy teaching of Edward Johnston at the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. Gill died in 1940, but his influence lived on long after, and indeed still does. Next. This is a fairly typical product of the Gill workshop, done in 1937, so quite nearly at the end of Gill's life. He died in 1940. These are classical Roman capitals, but it's important to realize that they're only classical Roman capitals in a kind of generic sense. Gill's work had its own character and was very far from stiffly formal. But the tradition established by Johnston and Gill did place a high value on clarity, legibility, elegance, and letters derived from the study of the purest and least mannered, if you like, historical examples. Next. Such as the famous Trajan inscription from Rome, carved in 113 AD, which is held in some circles to be a kind of model of perfection of Roman carved capitals from the imperial period. Next. Now, Ralph Beyer was born in Berlin in 1921 into what you could call a cultured family. His father, on the right there, Oscar Beyer, was an influential freelance writer on a huge range of cultural matters in fields such as music, art, architecture, religion. His interests ranged widely from Johann Sebastian Bach to medieval art, from the culture of so-called primitive societies, and to the latest developments in modernism, expressionism, the Bauhaus, and so on. Next slide, please. He knew many of the leading artistic figures of the time. You can see here some of the products of that period. On the left there is a poster for the an exhibition organized by Kunstdienst, which was an organization that Oscar Bayer co-founded. And then expressionist painting, Bauhaus, furniture, and on the right there's something by Rudolf Koch, who we'll come back to. Ralph's mother, Margarete, was from a well-to-do, liberally minded Jewish family, as Edmund mentioned, and she shared, it seems, many of Oscar's enthusiasms and his progressive views. So Ralph's early childhood was spent in the thick of those feverish developments in art, architecture, design, and so on of the Weimar Republic. Next. But with the rise of Nazism, the Beyers decided to leave Germany. And from 1933 to 1937, they lived in various temporary homes for some of the time on the island of Crete, which you can see at the top there. So that top picture is of a house that they managed to build there, though they barely lived in it before they moved on to Liechtenstein and eventually to Switzerland, where Ralph was sent to an international school near Geneva, where the bottom photo was taken, I think, when he was 16. In 1937, the family returned to Germany, fatefully as it turned out, since Margarete, his mother, was eventually interned in Auschwitz, where she died in 1945, just after the camp had been liberated by the Russians. But to return to 1937, Ralph was 16, as I said, and it was decided that he would go to England. In fact, to Eric Gill in the Chiltern Hills, with the idea of training as a printer at the Hague and Gill Press in High Wycombe. And this was through the suggestion of a mutual friend who had also emigrated, the architect Eric Mendelsohn. Next. In fact, the printing idea didn't work out, and Ralph found himself up at Pigot's, Gill's workshop, learning the rudiments of stone carving and lettering. And this is a photograph of the first thing he carved, with him carving it. And with luck, in a moment, we can listen to a sound clip of Ralph talking about this when I interviewed him in 2005. I would say that the sound isn't great, so you may have to listen rather carefully. It starts with me asking him if he'd any previous experience of carving. Okay, Monica, can we try the clip?
He would have presumably had a huge amount of experience. I know, I don't know, I didn't. Yes. So did he kind of teach you? Well, the thing was that I had to, as a first piece to teach me to produce something, was a sort of headstone with quite an elaborate molding, and also had included the hand of God emerging from the clouds, and a Greek inscription. And so I'd done that. Right. Yeah. Was that actually the first thing you carved? Yes. Right. Yes. And then this thing from beginning to end, you see. Right. They got this piece of stone. So you did the whole thing? Did the whole thing. Right. And he trusted you to do that? Well, it wasn't for anything. Oh, it wasn't the commission? It wasn't given. Ah, right. Right. And did he actually, I mean, did anybody actually teach you what to do? Oh, yes. Yeah. Laurie Cribb. Laurie Cribb, yes.
I hope you could hear that. Nice to hear Ralph's voice. Next slide, please, Monica. This was Ralph's first alphabet drawing. The bits in pencil in grey are Ralph's, with Gill's corrections in red over the top. Ralph later said that this made him realize for the first time that there was a logic in the construction of letters, by which I think he meant that there were certain structural principles underlying any alphabet which carry over from one letter to another. I'll let you have a look at that just for a little bit. Those letterers amongst you might be interested to look at some of the detail. Interesting at the bottom there, I wonder what Gill was demonstrating there, possibly the historical origin of lowercase coming out of the capitals. I've only just noticed that. Well, Ralph was with Gill for about 6 months, during which time he decided that he wanted to be a sculptor. And at the end of his time with Gill, he managed to enroll at the Central School of Arts and Crafts in London, and also on life modelling classes with Henry Moore in Chelsea. At Gill's, he had encountered a small Henry Moore sculpture, which Gill owned, and Ralph felt a strong sense of recognition. It seemed to be in tune with those modernist currents in art, which were familiar to him from his upbringing. But then the war came, and in the summer of 1940, Ralph was interned, along with all German nationals then living in Britain. Eventually, he was able to serve in the British Army in the Pioneer Corps, who did sort of heavy duties such as felling trees and laying railway tracks and things like that. And after the war, Ralph eventually moved, now with a young family, to Cambridge, getting work as a jobbing letter cutter. He got to know the letter carver David Kindersley, another ex-Gill trainee, and eventually went to work for him. Next slide, please. Here's Ralph at the back there, with Kevin Cribb in the front, who is the son of the Laurie Cribb that Ralph mentioned in that sound clip. And they're working on an inscription on the chapel at the American Cemetery at Madingley near Cambridge for David Kindersley. It was in 1953, after he'd finished with Kindersley, that Ralph decided to go freelance and to move to London, where there might be more work, perhaps including some teaching. Now, in nearly all the letter cutting that Ralph had done so far, he was carving letters someone else had designed. And the move to London coincided with a new direction in his attitude to lettering, sparked off at least in part by reading an article in the Architectural Review by Nicolette Gray. Next. Nicolette Gray, who many of you will know was a writer on lettering as well as many other things, bemoaned in this article what she saw as the lack of inventiveness in carved lettering in Britain. She considered a lot of inscriptional carving to be slavish imitation of imperial Roman capital letters. And she said, "One of the things we want is a new approach for the sign writer and the letter cutter, the idea that theirs is the practice of inventive and independent arts." And at the end of the article, as you can see here, she reproduced a small crayon inscription by her friend, the artist and poet David Jones. Now, David Jones's very personal painted inscriptions, which weren't intended for public consumption, have been inspired by primitive lettering, such as some of the early Christian inscriptions in the Roman catacombs. Next. And this was a subject which much interested Ralph's father, Oscar Bayer. One of the first books that he wrote in 1927, not this one here, but an earlier one, was on the catacomb carvings. And he was about to publish another one, as seen here. This is the second one. So Ralph began to see that a rougher, more informal approach to inscriptional design might be a way forward in his own work. Next. And the first chance he had to put these new ideas into practice was on this altar at the Royal Foundation of St. Catherine in East London. And it came about through a designer that Ralph had met, who Edmund mentioned in his introduction, Keith Murray here on the bottom left. That photo was taken a few years later, who had designed this altar, the basic structure of the altar, which is made of slate. As you can see, not a great photo, but as you can see, Ralph's lettering isn't exactly radically irregular, but nor is it formal Roman. Again, you can see some of the things I pointed out in embryo here, if you like. If you look at that bottom line, some slanting crossbars of A's and E's and slight variation of letters throughout. The A in particular has a top, which is definitely not a classical formal one. Next. But the work, of course, which Ralph is best known for, and which was by far the biggest and most prestigious commission of his career, even though it came quite early on, is the lettering in Coventry Cathedral, of which the main element is these 8 tablets of the word, as they became known, which you can see here on either side of the nave. And Edmund mentioned the Graham Sutherland tapestry at the end there. To cut a long story short, Coventry Cathedral was built at the beginning of the 1960s to replace the old one, destroyed in an air raid in 1940. The architect was Basil Spence, and Ralph first went to see Spence in 1954, largely thanks to Nikolaus Pevsner, the writer on art and architecture. Pevsner was 19 years older than Ralph and had known his father in Berlin. He'd also been interned at Huyton Camp at the beginning of the war and had sort of taken Baer under his wing there. And throughout Bayer's career, he proved a staunch supporter of his work. Anyway, Spence was impressed by Bayer's ideas for lettering that wasn't formal Roman and took some of its inspiration from the catacomb inscriptions. Next. This is one of the tablets, the one on the right, the far right in the overall shot. These are about 6 foot high. They vary a bit in width, but around 15 feet wide, so they're fairly big. And as you can see here, I think, well, no, you can't quite yet. You will in the next slide, perhaps. But hang on a minute, Monica. The tablets were carved by hand, entirely by hand, by Ralph and his 17-year-old assistant, Michael Watson. And each tablet took about 10 days of actual carving. Next. And this slide, close-up of one of the tablets, and an even more close-up of the bottom of one of the letters, shows how the carving is quite rough. But this is very much of a piece with the lettering design and the whole conception of the tablets. They're slightly painted with white lime wash because although they look very striking here, Ralph was a bit disappointed with the way the light hit them right at the end of the commission when he'd finished them, so they were lightly painted. Next. They carved the tablets in 1961. So over 6 years after Ralph's first meeting with Spence in 1954. And during that time, Ralph's designs for the tablets underwent considerable changes. In fact, the most radical overhaul happened very late on. What you can see here at the top is one of what Ralph thought would be his set of final designs, dated February 1959. In this series, as you can see, the lettering was much smaller than it ended up being, with much more blank space around the inscription. Spence urged Ralph to make the letters bigger and more irregular. And Ralph's designs, final designs, very final designs, which were done at the 11th hour, most of them indeed after he'd started carving the first tablets, incorporated Spence's wishes for the lettering to be bigger and to fill the whole space. Although, in fact, I think there is evidence that that's what they had both envisaged right at the start, but Ralph's designs had drifted somewhat from that, that idea. Next. There's a lot more lettering in Coventry Cathedral than just the tablets, including some metal inscriptions. These large brass letters, and this whole inscription is about 50 feet across the floor of the nave inside the main entrance. And there's a lot more as well in different parts of the cathedral. Next. Now, Tanya mentioned this, Edmund mentioned this piece. This was done the year before Ralph carved the Coventry tablets. It's a frieze of lettering around the porch. It's on 3 sides of this porch of the Church of St. Paul's at Bow Common in East London. This was the first church designed by the architectural partnership of Keith Murray and Robert Maguire, and was quite radical, as Edmund said. These letters were first cut out of soft board, the concrete was cast around them, and then the board removed and the letters painted. They were repainted, and that's what you see here, in 2010 for the church's 50th anniversary. Next. Now, the area behind the church was redeveloped quite recently, and streets and blocks were named after people of local residence, of local relevance, not residence. And it's a shame that Ralph didn't live to see this. I think he would have been delighted. He would have been particularly delighted that they'd spelt his surname right, which unfortunately they didn't on the map that shows you the way around the place on the board outside the estate. Okay, next. Now, the work that Ralph always considered his second most significant after Coventry was a series of inscriptions at New Harmony in Indiana in the USA, commissioned by that Jane Owen, who, again, Edmund mentioned. I went there in, I think it was September 2002, to see and photograph his work. Indiana at the time was in the grip of a spell of damp, dull weather, and I began to despair that I was actually going to get any decent photos until the last day, about 2 hours before I was due to leave, when the sun finally came out. This is a memorial to the Christian philosopher Paul Tillich, whose ashes are buried here. Ralph's family had known Tillich, who also emigrated from Germany, but this time to the USA with the rise of Nazism. Ralph designed a series of extracts from Tillich's writings, which were sandblasted onto boulders, of which this one is much the largest. Next. And these are some more. So these are sandblasted, as I said, they're not hand cut. Thank goodness the sun came out. Next. Some years later, Ralph was asked to inscribe the 10 Commandments for a chapel that was to be built on the end of an accommodation building near the woodland where the boulders are. These are hand cut, not sandblasted, as the boulder inscriptions were. Now, as I said, the person behind these commissions was, at New Harmony, was Jane Owen. She was the daughter of a Texan oil magnate, and she was also responsible for Ralph doing another series of inscriptions up in Scotland. Next. Of which this is one. I think this is another particularly successful composition of constantly varying letter forms. It's at Haddington in East Lothian. Not a great photo. I took this one many years ago. Again, went to see these things, and again, the weather was appalling, and I despaired and left. And then about 10 minutes after I'd left, the sun came out, rushed back, went into the church next door, grabbed 6 chairs, piled them up one on top of the other, and sat on the top of the top one on this rickety pile of chairs, and finally got the photo. Alan Forrest, who I think is out there watching tonight, took some much better shots some years later. So Ralph Beyer's work here has come a long way since that altar at St. Catherine's. It's often at its best when he masses the letters together like this. And he once said he'd learned that from Rudolf Koch. Next. Now, Rudolf Koch, as many of you will know, was a calligrapher, type designer, and craftsman in many ways, whose work flourished in Germany between the wars. Ralph's father, Oscar, knew him very well. And he credited Koch with teaching him how lettering could be an expressive art form. And that understanding very much informed Oscar Beyer's appreciation of those catacomb inscriptions, and hence, in the end, of Ralph's attitude to lettering. And this is a piece by Rudolf Koch, one of the four Gospels. And that is, of course, Rudolf Koch there in that photo. Next. Now, this word expressive is a tricky one, of course. Expressive of what? I had an email recently from someone, Christoffel, thanks if you're out there, who was puzzled that Ralph Beyer's work could be thought of as expressive of the meaning of the words, since his lettering changes so little from one text to another. Even in the Coventry tablets, where there's more variation in letter size within one inscription than Ralph ever did anywhere else, this is not obviously related to the meaning, something which Nicolette Gray was critical of. I'd suggest that the restraint of Ralph Beyer's work is rather like an actor reading a text quietly and steadily, with understanding and a distinctive voice, without histrionics. It's not so much directly expressive of the meaning of the words, which may be open to interpretation, as more indirectly expressive of Ralph's reaction to and respect for them. Ralph once referred to Koch's writing out of text as a symbolic or ritual act. Next. So Beyer isn't imposing an interpretation, and certainly he's not trying to impress by means of virtuoso carving technique or striking or slick design. For those who like this kind of thing, these pieces of Ralph's are visually pleasing sculptural objects, independently of the text. But more importantly, they are carriers of the text. Next. So he, if you like, invites you to consider the text slowly, because this isn't book type designed for rapid reading. It's an invitation made appealing by the human irregularity, perhaps even the hesitancy, the rhythm, and definitely the musicality. He was very interested in music, of its presentation. And this piece is a text by the artist Paul Klee. Next. Thank you. That's the end of my bit. Hopefully we can now perhaps go back to Monica and then start the discussion.
Indeed. Let's now what I'm going to do is something that I hope will work by pinning you both. Then everybody will see you both on the screen at the same time, which is what we want. Right, add pin. Let's see. Does that work? Add pin. Yes, there we go. Very good. Lovely. So as I said at the beginning, well, thank you very much, first of all, John. That was wonderful. And now we'll hand over to Tanya. Tanya, you're muted. You're muted, Tanya, to be John's interlocutor and sort of set the conversation going. And as I said before, I see there are a few things that have come through the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at them yet, but please do start those questions and comments coming with great pleasure, and we'll come to them towards the end. Okay, over to you, Tanya.
Well, John, that was a wonderful talk, and I need hardly say it's a terrific book. And I'll ask you a few general questions, but then we have slides that we can kind of discuss. So we won't be speaking, as it were, into a void. But I wanted to start by asking you, what sort of drew you to write this terrific and very comprehensive biography and life and work beautifully brought together of Ralph Beyer?
Well, I'd say I don't see it as a biography. I was always very clear that I wasn't writing really about his life, but inevitably that does come in. It first started actually as a kind of idea for a fairly short monograph after one had been published by about Tom Perkins, who taught me letter carving. And I suggested it would be nice to do one on Ralph Beyer, not meaning that I would write it, but that there should be one published. And then the chap who published Tom said, well, would you like to write it? And I thought, no way. But then I'd always been interested in his work. So I thought, well, maybe it would be a chance to interview him, to get to know him a bit. And it kind of grew from there, really.
Oh, that's wonderful. Actually, I feel your interviews should join the interviews. I interviewed him at some length for the British Library, but I'm sure they'd be pleased to accept your interviews. The interview I did actually can be consulted by anyone if you go online. I don't know whether you found that he was quite a reticent person to interview, because I went back to listening to my interview. I remember at the time thinking, I'm hopeless at this, But actually it sounds okay. But
it certainly does. I mean, yeah.
He was quite an elusive personality. But I just wanted to ask you, although Ralph trained with Eric Gill, and he arrived in Britain when he was very, very young, he was 16. So he left Germany for good then, really. What always fascinates me is that it seems that his upbringing in Berlin and Dresden and his father's friendships with artists, perhaps above all Rudolf Koch, and Ralph, Ralph often spoke of his understanding of modern movement architecture and his interest in German expressionist painting and the new typography. And then when he was interned at Huyton in 1940, which must have been fairly traumatic, in some ways he returned to that world, if in rather grim circumstances, especially through meeting Pevsner. So do you feel he, in a sense, is a Central European artist who somehow got stranded here, and that kept him somewhat apart from other craftspeople, perhaps, rather in the way I always felt Hans Koper was rather, and to an extent Lucie, they sort of did keep themselves somewhat aloof. That came over very strongly in the 1952 conference down at Dartington. There was something,
yes,
a secret standard that he adhered to.
Well, I think that, certainly what you say about Huyton camp, it must have been quite a stimulating time, actually, because there were a lot of very distinguished people interned there, and they gave lectures and things on all their specialist subjects, and so yeah, it would have been quite a stimulating time, I think, for all its hardship. But yeah, I think that background just gave Ralph a very different starting point, really, in his attitude to art, and I think he did probably feel not really part of what a colleague of his called the arty crafty sort of side of the lettering scene in Britain. He didn't really have much time for calligraphy. I think partly because he'd never really done it himself, but I think his inclinations were much more towards sculpture, towards kind of those strands in European modernism and so on. And so I think, yes, he probably never really felt much at home with that sort of Gill tradition, which was very firmly rooted by then in this country. By the way, let me say, when you mentioned your interviews, they are a tremendous resource. I mean, I had to go to the British Library and listen to tapes because it was pre-internet times, and I ensconced myself in there for a few days. I mean, there are 10 tapes, aren't there? So they're tremendously.
Well, they're all these interviews are life story interviews. Every single interview in the National Life Story Collection is a life story interview. So they are extraordinarily lengthy, 10, 20 tapes, but thank goodness now they've been digitalized and you can listen in your own home, which is a great step.
I didn't know that. I mean, he opened up to you much more than he did to me.
Well, it wasn't easy, but should we look at the first slide? I don't know the order they're in, but now it looks as though I have to go. Hold on.
They're right at the end.
Yes. No. There we go. Yes. Oh, yeah. Right. Well, that's that. I remember sort of seeing that, heart in mouth almost, because when I went, it was a very rough, rundown area, and the church, of course, was built very much with the local community in mind, in particular dockers who worked in the area. So the interior's beautiful, but all the materials are rugged, and Ralph seems to have empathized with that. And when you read This is the Gate of Heaven and you see that very austere porch and then beyond sort of tower blocks, that it's a sort of kind of strange message of hope, isn't it? But did you feel that Ralph, he had a very good relationship with architects?
Very much so. I mean, he, compared to most letter cutters nowadays, a far bigger proportion of his commissions came through architects, and I think he had a great interest in architecture, yes, he in fact the majority of his work was through architects, and I think he could talk their language and understood what they were doing, and I think there was a sort of common language which I think helped hugely. Especially in this case, I mean, obviously he struck up a very good relationship with Keith Murray.
Yeah.
They had a lot of points in common.
Yes, they obviously got on incredibly well. And but it sort of struck me generally that Ralph's work has perhaps been admired more outside the lettering community by architects, perhaps the clergy, individual patrons, art historians like Pevsner. Do you think I'm?
No, I think that is very true. I think certainly in times past, anyway, there was a lack of understanding, perhaps, of what he was trying to do. I mean, it's easy to judge bits of lettering by those kind of classical standards, which many of us were trained in, and whereas somebody coming at it from a non-specialist point of view might simply react to it. And because Ralph's work was so kind of personal and human, I think that that appealed to people a lot, and particularly with the headstone commissions. Actually, there are numerous letters in Ralph's archive of people expressing rapturous thanks for work he did. I mean, far more than I've ever had.
Should we have the next slide? Oh yes. You showed these wonderful images, the way you can look down the nave at Coventry Cathedral and see these enormous tablets. But I just wanted to reflect a bit on the rather mixed reception they got when Coventry Cathedral was consecrated, particularly the response of Nicolette Gray, who made a very unfavourable comparison with the person whose work she clearly admired hugely, the painted inscriptions of David Jones. And that must have been so disappointing for Ralph, because he had felt that, she had become a friend and an advisor. And also, I think the fact that the tablets were in a sense a collaboration with his father, who had, as you say, published these books an early book on catacomb inscriptions and was working on another book. And the fact that the father and son were separated during the war, that his mother died shortly after the war, I sort of feel that must have made Nicolette Gray's criticism all the more painful. Do you sort of understand what she was getting at?
I do. Yeah, I mean, I think there are obviously many ways of seeing these tablets, and Ralph certainly was very upset by her comments. I mean, just for those who don't know, Nicolette Gray wrote a review which criticized Ralph's, I mean, partly the what she saw as random variations in size, and she also didn't really like his letter forms, which I think she described as ugly. And she said that she didn't think he had the, I forget the exact words, but the creative sensitivity or something that David Jones could have brought to the work. Ralph was very upset by this, and all those years later when I interviewed him, he was still quite, you could see he was quite upset by it. And he said that she hadn't understood what he was trying to do. She was looking at it very much from the point of view of individual letter forms, and whether it worked as a composition of letter forms. And whereas Ralph was looking at it more from a conveyor of the words. Now, I think that is a slightly dubious, it's an argument that you can sort of pick apart. And I think there is some truth in some of the criticisms of these things. I mean, I think their scale, for one thing, is certainly impressive, but you could argue that they're as big as they are because that's what Spence wanted, really, and that Ralph's natural inclinations were to make them smaller, less shouty, which was perhaps his own kind of preference, really. And that they are, I sometimes see them like a sort of intimate conversation amplified over a multi-megawatt PA system, sort of. But that's just one way of looking at it. On the other hand, they're an amazing thing, and she did praise his courage and the fact that he'd done something that was really very much against the norm at the time. Later on, she actually praised him for going back to more less irregular letters, which was ironic.
It's interesting, the middle line where the which is sort of pressed like that. It's sort of, and then the proceed sort of shrinks in scale. But
yes. But
I mean, I think the fact that you can almost read them as you come into the church is somehow rather wonderful, and they're having to do the job of sculpture to an extent, because I think in the beginning, Spence had this idea of relief sculptures, didn't he?
That's right. Yeah, and Henry Moore advised against it because he didn't think there was anybody who could do a good enough job. Apparently.
Gosh. Well, should we go and look at another? Move forward to the next slide. Yes. And these are just two examples of headstones. And one on the right, I think that's for Robert Maguire's mother, isn't it?
That's right.
And the other for his father. But I mean, they are in a sense very simple, but the way in which they're kind of ranged in a rather unexpected way, I think gets you sort of reading them. I don't know. It's sort of,
especially the one on the right, which it's very unusual to have the epitaph like that, much bigger than the name for a start. And then yes, that sort of fact that it's sort of semi-ranged left, but not really. That's very characteristic of Ralph's work. And they are, although they're unusual, they are quiet. They're not. Again, they don't shout, which can be a disadvantage, of course, because he carved quite lightly, as Gill did as well. And so these days, with weathering and so on, quite a lot of them are a bit difficult to read. But you're right, they do make you look.
I mean, he had these sort of slight bees in his bonnet about he didn't like a beautiful centralized layout. He didn't like sort of fine calligraphically inspired lettering, and he had a prejudice against slate, which he said was like a piece of paper. And after all, well, I know you and the Kindersley Workshop, I mean, there've been beautiful things done in slate, but can you sort of empathize with this prejudice against slate? You wanted something very stony, as it were.
Yes, well, I think there the point is that because he really wanted to be a sculptor, I mean, that's what, as I said, when he was working at Gill's, that idea took shape in his mind. And he did say that had it not been for the war, he probably would have tried to make a living as a sculptor. And that was his first love. And I think he was always conscious of the three-dimensional sculptural nature of everything he did. For that reason, for example, he wanted plaques on a wall to stick out a bit from the wall. And slate, yes, is a very graphic medium because the cut part, the letters, for a start, they are a different color from the surface of the slate. And they're very precise as well. You can get a very fine line. And also bits of slate are usually very thin. So all those things didn't really accord with, I think, with Ralph's kind of sculptural instincts. And the fact that he would go back over the thing, he'd sort of go back over the letters and carve them again and again. Whereas with slate, you want a fairly decisive kind of chisel pass, really, to get the thing precise and accurate. So yeah, I think that's a very good point and exemplifies his attitude, I think.
Can we have the next slide?
Oh, I think, is that the last?
I don't think there is a next slide.
Oh, that's fine. Well, I just wanted to ask you about an exhibition that was put on in Powys, Newtown, at 31, and sort of made me think that it's quite, you're a brilliant artist in lettering, and yet there aren't that many exhibitions, and I believe that exhibition had quite a lot to do with you. And I know there's been wonderful work done by more memorials by artists, the Lettering Arts Trust, founded by Harriet Fraser. But when you think about the V&A, I don't think there is a display of lettering,
No.
And so lettering can drop beneath the radar. I was quite struck by, it was really nice that they'd named that building after Ralph Beyer, all that. But again, the lettering wasn't terribly exciting,
On the building, on that plaque, no.
Yeah. And I was very struck by this wonderful
Verdana typefish. No, that's right. I mean, that exhibition you mentioned in Newtown was really instigated by a chap called Mark Evans, who lives in Cambridge. Yes, it was almost by accident, really, I think the biggest exhibition of his work and drawings. And the interesting coincidence there is that Robert Owen, who founded New Harmony in Indiana, actually came from Newtown. And when Ralph and Hilary drove with Ralph's work because Ralph didn't drive, so when they drove into Newtown, they saw this sign saying, "Welcome to Newtown, birthplace of Robert Owen," and that was a nice coincidence. But anyway, you're right. I mean, lettering does often slip under the radar. It used to be rather more evident in the Crafts Council, but doesn't seem to be much these days. But yes, the Memorial Arts Trust, with their place at Snape, have a permanent exhibition of quite a few pieces, but there isn't much really anywhere else. And in terms of seeing Ralph's work, really, apart from Coventry and Haddington that I mentioned, and obviously in the US, New Harmony, apart from really maybe Richmond and East Sheen cemeteries in London are probably the best place to go and see his headstones. But otherwise, there isn't really anywhere you can go and have a look at a collection of his work.
Yes.
Or indeed a collection by any letter carver, really, come to think of it, not even Gill.
No.
And the Craft Study Centre, of course, have a certain amount in Farnham, in Surrey.
No, it was brought home to me where there was this, I thought, very good television series done by Brodie.
Oh, yes.
But it was called The Secret History of Writing, and that sort of to sum up the problem, which your wonderful book, has gone a good way to, it's such a wonderful book. It will make people think again about lettering in general, I think.
Oh, thank you. I hope so.
Shall we open up to other questions, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's just the right moment to do so. I'm just scrolling through. There are all sorts of very different kinds of questions. I've got some of my own, but I think probably for reasons of time, let me sort of bite my tongue and go through the ones that have appeared in the chat first. A very specific question, first of all, from Barbara Howard. Is the Baer Gill alphabet done freehand?
Oh, I think so, yes. I mean, I think what I suspect is that Gill just sat him down and said, draw an alphabet.
Mm.
And he would have drawn that, and then Gill would have drawn over the top. I don't know the full circumstances, but I suspect that's what happened.
And then from the same person, I'd love to see where you can see the inscriptions pictured at the very beginning. Are they accessible at all?
At the beginning of what?
Of your presentation, I
of the talk.
Yeah.
Well, the one that I started with, the that Chatter Me Music piece, is in the Craft Study Centre in Farnham, and that can be viewed by appointment. And what else? I can't even remember what I started with. Oh, the Hull, the very first one, the Hull sculptures seem to have disappeared. I haven't been able to track those down.
Gosh, I wondered about those.
Yeah, I did all sorts of detective work, but I think that area where they were has been rebuilt. They were in the College of Commerce in Hull. So if there's anybody out there who lives in Hull and wants to go on a little investigation, then I'd be very interested. But as far as I know, they probably no longer exist.
Because there's also the lost seated woman.
Yes, it's Birkbeck College,
University College London, that has again vanished. Shows how fragile.
Perhaps I can actually butt in there. I mean, one question that immediately comes to my own mind as an art historian rather than a lettering or craft specialist. I mean, you've touched on several times the fact that he had ambitions as a sculptor, and I wonder whether there was a regret. I mean, first of all, did he continue on the side, as it were, creating three-dimensional sculptural works? And tied in with that, did he have a residual regret that he wasn't able to actually earn a living to devote most of his creative energies to sculpture?
I think the answer to both those questions is yes.
Yeah.
He did carry on doing sculpture in his own time, and sometimes exhibited it, again, partly thanks to Pevsner. There were opportunities for that. And he was commissioned as a sculptor on one or two occasions, which I do mention in the book. But yes, I think, not only, it was very difficult. I mean, obviously after the war, he had to earn a living, and he had a family, a young family, and he got work as a jobbing letter cutter. I mean, it would have been almost impossible to have earned a living as a sculptor at that time. But I think he got drawn into lettering, and eventually, I think he was reasonably happy to have done that. But yes, I think he was all the time very interested in sculpture, and would have loved, I'm sure, to have been a successful sculptor.
A nice comment from John Allen. As inspecting architect for St. Paul's Bow Common for about 10 years, I had the privilege of restoring, you probably know this, restoring Ralph Bayer's inscription around
with the help of, with Robert.
coincidentally, I drove past it this very afternoon, and report that it's still looking good. That's John Allen of Avanti Architects. Nice to know. Good. A question from David Woodward. Were Ralph's children creatively engaged, he's asking?
Well, Ralph's children may well be in the audience. Most of them are still alive. I don't think any of them had a visual art career afterwards, but they all went their own way.
Would anybody, dare I ask, if they are present, whether they'd like to chip in, perhaps unmute themselves and say a few words as a direct descendant? No pressure, but that would be lovely. From David Woodward again, a great sense of continuity of tradition in the story of 20th century British lettering. It would be interesting to know who you consider to be Ralph Bayer's greatest pupils. Did he have pupils as such?
Yes, well, I haven't really mentioned, but he did teach. He taught all throughout his career, really, in various places. Never full time, but most prominently at the Reading University, where he taught lettering he taught sessions on lettering as part of the typography course and type design course there, and also at the City and Guilds art school in London. He never taught letter carving, though, not in an institution as such, but he did have people come to work for him, many younger sort of trainees, and well, not exactly trainees, but people he did teach, and people who came to work for him. So there are quite a lot of people out there who were taught by Ralph, and who continue as letter carvers today.
Good. We've got a number of practical questions about the availability of the book. I perhaps should say at this juncture, although there's some useful comments as to how best to avoid Amazon, the dreaded Amazon. But Lund Humphries, as you may have noticed when you first came in, is offering a 20% discount off the cover price until the end of the month. So do check out their website in the first instance. And also, yes, sort of also some messages that I think everybody can see about where else. I think the Craft Centre in Farnham is certainly a primary location, isn't it, for seeing examples of his work at first hand. A more complex question here from Tim Parry Williams. How was the approach to writing the book informed by your direct knowledge of Baer? As you relate, the work is often restrained or understated, whilst the research and content is in places almost forensic in a good way, he adds. What did you perhaps want to reveal, or indeed not reveal, to the reader in respect of what you understood of the artist, a specialist subject confident? Complex question there.
Yeah, that needs some thinking about.
Yes.
Hello, Tim. I suppose, I mean, again, I go back to the point that I was trying to write a book about his work and not about him. But if you mean how much was it informed by my knowledge of the man, I mean, that obviously did come into it. But I tried to keep sort of biographical stuff really out of it as far as possible, but include it where it seemed relevant. And obviously his personality and character do show themselves in the work. I mean, Tanya, you probably, I mean, you knew him, I think, better than I did, so you might be better placed to perhaps to answer if what Tim's asking there is to an extent how does his personality show itself in the work. I don't know whether that is what you're asking, Tim, but how would you say that, Tanya?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about there being a kind of secret, not a secret, but a sort of special standard that he sort of cleaved to, and it was based, I think, on this Central European kind of background that he greatly respected, and that had perhaps formed him, even though he did leave Germany when he was so young. And I think he found it quite hard to sort of convey it. Well, he wrote one or two rather beautiful short pieces about his ideals and his background. But he could also get quite sort of agitated about standards, I suppose. And I think you convey that. And certainly this idea that he was slightly apart from the broad stream of letter cutting in Britain. I don't know whether that's answered the question at all.
Yeah, Tim's just sent me an email actually to explain more what he was asking.
Perhaps that's a conversation you can continue, John, on another.
Conveying the artist's mind, thinking and understanding and so on, which, yeah, I'm not sure I tried to do that. I think I was focusing more on the work in the book rather than the artist's mind. I don't think I would have been qualified to write about that.
I think Ralph was a very deep reader, and a lot of his inscriptions, they're very odd layout. You know, it's sort of vaguely ranged left, but not entirely. It's to make you keep reading. There's this discussion we had of putting emotion into letters. Well, there's something about Ralph's, there's a sort of swiftness about it all that's, and a kind of informality which is designed to keep you reading.
Yes, and it's interesting, one thing that Ralph's father wrote about Rudolf Koch's work was that even if it's difficult to read, which actually Ralph's isn't, but even if it was difficult to read, the point remains to read it, I think he said. So the words were vitally important for Koch, and they were, I think, for Ralph as well, the text.
A lovely comment here from I think it's Robin Kinross. One of his students from Reading here. He didn't teach us letter but he didn't teach us letter cutting. His teaching, and these are interesting words, was ethereal. I wonder what that means.
Yes.
And perhaps inspirational, bringing us vibes from Central Europe in the interwar years. Interesting.
Yeah, I think I say in my book that he was an inspirer rather than an instructor. Yeah, he never did teach letter cutting as such. He didn't teach technique.
Lots of lovely positive comments, and I think the chat will be saved, and I can certainly send it to you. You'll be pleased to see that. I have a question that relates, I guess, specifically to Coventry. Were any eyebrows raised at all by the fact that here was a Jewish erstwhile refugee, not a Christian, in other words, being given a major commission for the church? Because I'm well aware that when Basil Spence commissioned Epstein to do the extraordinary sculpture on the facade of Michael and the Devil, St. Michael and the Devil, there was at least one pretty hostile criticism, and Basil Spence's retort was, well, actually, Jesus was a Jew. And I just wondered if there's anything that might be at all relevant in Ralph's connection to Coventry.
Personally, I don't really know the answer to that question. I mean, the fact that he was German, I know, also did create some problems with some people there, but was probably also a point in his favor as far as Spence was concerned. I don't know, Tanya, do you have?
Well, it's rather interesting about Coventry. Yes, Ralph was Jewish, but so too was Hans Koper, who did the magnificent candlesticks, which are on the altar, and a few other things beside. And then we have to think about the young people who did the terrific glass in the nave, Keith New and Geoffrey Clark. They weren't in the slightest bit religious, so they had to start kind of, reading a bit of Paul Tillich and looking up articles in the Listener, and yet they produced beautiful religious glass. I mean, I think Lawrence Lee perhaps was practicing Christian, but they kind of rose to the occasion, I guess, all in their different ways. And after all, of course, Ralph's father was a leading Christian thinker,
Yes.
and a great expert on Christian art.
I mean, I think, that's quite important, really, because, I mean, Ralph's father, yes, exactly, and had he came from a family who I think his Ralph's grandfather, I think, was a pastor, wasn't he, if I remember rightly? But and so Ralph's upbringing was very much a Christian one, and Ralph, it's a little bit difficult how Ralph regarded his own religion. I even asked Hilary, his wife, about this after Ralph had died, and even she wasn't quite sure really how he would have. She said he'd probably describe himself as a Buddhist, but it would be a mistake to think of Ralph as a Jewish artist, I think, in the sense that his upbringing was more Christian than Jewish.
And yet he had a Jewish mother, however practicing or otherwise she was, who perished in the Holocaust.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah. So
not just about religion, is it? It's
no, totally.
A mother he adored, and it must have been. Yes, but his mother and father were very united on matters aesthetic, and the kind of Christianity his father was interested in was fairly unconventional. I think it was more to do with the new liturgy movement, which was very ecumenical and keen to reach out to every area of other religions. So
no, I find this. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say that the organization Kunstdienst that Ralph's father co-founded put on many exhibitions, very forward-looking, very innovative, bringing all sorts of modern art and things into a religious context. And he was a bit of a campaigner, really, for that kind of thing.
I mean, I find this a really interesting, kind of obviously very problematic and sort of knotty kind of cultural topic, which, ought to be explored further. And in fact, for those of you who are interested, there is this sort of very perplexing phenomenon whereby an awful lot of emigre artists who came to this country from Nazi Europe, some of them either partly Jewish, and of course a lot of the Jews were not, they were not observant, they're certainly not Orthodox, but nevertheless the Jewishness is significant within their background, ended up working for the church in this country. And for those of you who'd like to pursue the subject further, perhaps we can begin to round things off by me alerting you to a fact that on the 16th of June, there's going to be a one-day conference, which promises to be a very kind of heady mix of different talks, really interesting, on the theme, we've actually called it A Jewish Jesus, Art and Faith in the Shadow of the Second World War. And yes, it is advertised already on the Insiders Outsiders website, but do look out for it. It's hopefully, well, is it going to be face-to-face? I don't know. The plan is for it to be held at St. John's, Waterloo, the Festival of Britain Church, as some of you will know in this anniversary year, but also because they have, as again, some of you may know, 2 very fine murals by Hans Feibusch, another case in point. So I think, as I say, lots of thanks. So maybe it's time to just bring things to a close. Thank you, fascinating talk, wonderful, etc., etc. Lovely. Can I just, well, add my thanks, of course, to those of the assembled company, and just perhaps pick up on a few other things. I've mentioned the discount on the book. Please be aware of that from the, you've got the details, the, if you, now I'm just thinking, yes, if you go to the insidersoutsiders.org website and you, on the homepage, there's an entry for John's wonderful book, and if you click on that, you will actually see the code that you need to get the discount. But if there's any problem with that, then just contact the Insiders Outsiders Gmail address. I should also add, if I may, just one thing that I didn't mention, and that is that I too have a very personal connection to Lund Humphries. I've worked with them on many a project over many years, and most notably and most recently on the companion volume to the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which focuses specifically on the visual arts. It is still available. It came out in March 2019, and they're very kindly offering that also at a really quite generous discount on their website as well. And again, details are on the Insiders Outsiders homepage.
So, Monica, I just mentioned that
sure.
the book is a co-published with the Craft Study Centre as well.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that.
And you can also get it from them.
Okay, fine. Absolutely. Good. The other thing I'd like to mention, just apropos Lund Humphries, is they are bringing out another book on a different subject, but again, sort of in the broad terrain we're exploring here, about the architect Walter Siegel, who again came, from Central Europe and exercised a tremendous interest in the field of architecture. And that's coming out at the end of June, and we hope to do another online session about that. And just lastly, but I think not least, this whole area of internment. I don't know how much most of you know about this, but in 1940, at the end of the phony war, the British government, and Churchill in particular, famously said, "Collar the lot." There was this kind of mass panic at the idea that there might be among the serried ranks of the mostly Jewish refugees, and obviously anti-Nazi from Nazism, spies, fifth columnists, etc. And these people who thought they were safe in this country, among them quite clearly Ralph Beyer, were put behind barbed wire, some of them already having suffered some pretty tough times at the hands of the Nazis. So it's an extraordinary, deeply problematic historical episode. And this year is indeed the 80th anniversary of that time. And the Insiders Outsiders Festival has actually hosted quite a lot of events relating to the very rich cultural life, as you touched on yourselves, of the internment camp. So again, do look on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel if you're interested in pursuing that further. Good. I think that's probably enough for one day. That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Tanya. And I don't know if Edmund is still with us. Edmund, thank you very much too. And John particularly. And thank everybody for being with us, and all the very best, and look after yourselves. Take care and good night.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.